Violet Evergarden is beautiful, but it's also incredibly difficult to watch. My father died 4 years ago from cancer, and of course, I'm going to talk about episode 10. Episode 10 was terrible for a person who lost their dad. Death happens with everybody, but there's something about episode 10 that was so visceral for me. And I think because one of the things that's so incredible about Violet Evergarden is how raw, genuine, and heartfelt each interaction that Violet has with the various people she comes into contact with are. Those interactions are so genuine and so pure that anytime they happen, they don't feel excessive, fake, or put on. What they end up feeling is raw, real, and uncomfortable at times. Violet Evergarden, to me, is a exceptionally well-made show. It is slice of life, growing up. It is finding emotion. It is uncovering your past and moving on from your past. It is therapy. It is, interpersonal relationships. There is so much that goes into Violet. It's both episodic and long-form through-line plot. And it's interesting how the build to episode 10 happens, because episode 7 with the playwright who has lost his daughter and wife, that one was also very challenging. Up until episode 7, I did not think to myself, well, this is a show that's going to make me deeply emotional and uncomfortable. But it wasn't until that episode where I started to unravel a bit as we move into the different types of love and the different types of connections that people have with the people that they are writing letters for. Episode 7 was the moment in which I realized this show was not afraid to talk about death in a big way. We had seen death prior, but it wasn't until this particular episode that I recognized that Violet was a conduit for the journey and discussion of life and death, and how that equates to love. Obviously, the entire series is her looking for Major and coming to the conclusions that she comes to and learning how to accept herself and her being through that loss and discovery of the self. But episode 7, the moment that she jumps across the water to the playwright as they are creating that work together, and that music swells and Evan calls wonderful, wonderful orchestral writing takes over. In that moment, I recognized that I was in for a rough go of it. As we proceed through then to episode 10, you know it's coming. The build up to that moment is fascinating because we are seeing this through the lens of the child. She doesn't understand why Violet is taking her mother away from her, despite the fact that she can understand that there is, letters to be written and so on and so forth. We, the audience, are that child when we lose someone that we love, that we're close to, that we have a deep emotional connection with. That child is not stupid, I don't think. That child knows that time is running out. She sees when her mother is sick. She sees that there's something going on. So then Violet being there is robbing her of time with her mother, not realizing that the purpose of Violet being there is an altruistic and ultimately important one that will prolong the mother's relationship with that daughter well beyond her death. The thing that they talk about in grief counseling is the fact that death sustains relationships. It's not like a breakup where there's a closing point to a relationship with a person, place, or thing. Like when we break up with someone, that relationship is over. If we choose to remain friends, that's a different conversation. In death, however, the relationship continues. The dynamic that you have with the person that has gone still exists for you, and theoretically, if we speak on it spiritually, for them. Now, you may not be able to call them or speak to them directly, but that doesn't mean that that relationship is over. It just means that the relationship changes. The difficulty with grief lies in learning how to process and manage that grief, and most often grief goes mismanaged through the self because there's no feedback from the other party, despite the fact that that relationship is continuing. It was a very difficult and painful lesson for me to learn. It went from seeing birds out in the wild and thinking, oh my God, my dad, crying, to now, 4 years later, seeing birds, seeing cardinals, seeing different signs of my father's presence in my life and saying, oh, Dad. There's a big difference between those two. And in episode 10 of Violet Evergarden, I think what ends up happening is we are given access to that well, to that grief jar that many of us feel. Maybe some of us haven't experienced it yet. Those of us with grief in our lives, understand that the jar gets bigger. The ball that is grief does not change size. At the beginning of our grief, upon the acuteness of a death, that jar is very small. The ball hits against the jar very frequently. As we grow into grief and understanding grief, understanding too that we carry grief with us every single step of our lives after a moment of death, we know that that jar does get bigger. So the ball will still hit the corners sometimes, like the old DVD symbol as it goes into the corner. When the ball hits the corners, it hurts. And in episode 10 of Violet Evergarden, for those of us that have experienced sickness and death, boy, does that hit in a big way. When my father was very sick, we had about a week before we knew he was dying. And I asked him to write a letter. Dad, can you write me a letter so I can look back on you and your handwriting and your thoughts and feelings and connect with them? He refused because that would be an admission of death. The mother in Violet Evergarden episode 10 recognizes and understands, maybe because her daughter is young and impressionable, that it's her role and her value in death is to be with her daughter through word, through a physical thing that mother had touched, the letters themselves. Not everyone is able to accept and tolerate or even condone their own death. My father fought until the very last day he possibly could to be alive. It was an admission of defeat to write a letter expressing love. And yet in episode 10 of Violet Evergarden, here we have a mother who's unwilling to let death be the end of her, to be a presence for her daughter, to carry her daughter through her life. Because the fact of the matter is that mother does miss out on so many things. She does miss out on the partner. She does miss out on the birth of the child. She does miss out on the growth of the child. But she chose in some way to be there. And that is a powerful and deeply emotionally unsettling thing to witness. And when you think about anime, the music, the visual, the story, that's what's compelling. When all three of those mix in the wash, you get episode 10 of Violet Evergarden. A brutal, challenging, painful, uncomfortable experience. And after episode 10, we get episode 11, The Dying Soldier. All he wants to do is go back to his loved one. Violet Evergarden did an incredible thing. It allows you to connect to real big feelings that we all experience in our own ways. Some might say it ventures into emotional manipulation or even, dare I say it, grief porn. I'm not going to suggest that, even though at times while watching this show, especially those last couple episodes, I did feel like it toed the line very close to that. However, what I would say is that the honesty and the truth on display when it came to talking about grief, love, loss, and life was so earnest that it couldn't help but feel very real. And there's naturally a pushback against a lot of those big feelings, especially when it comes to death and grief. For those of us that have experienced those things, we know what that feels like, and sometimes having to feel it again is very uncomfortable. A week after my father died, my great aunt passed away. And I'll tell you what, the funeral of my father was very bad, but the funeral of my great aunt was 10 times worse, because I was reopening, pouring salt into an already wide open wound. That kind of pain, emotional pain, is very difficult to tolerate. So Violet Evergarden did something that is very difficult to do in media. It felt real in a big way. I'm so grateful I saw it. Would I ever want to watch Violet Evergarden ever again? Absolutely never. Frieren touches on some of the similar tropes, death especially, life, how to move on, how to become the thing that people see in you, how to learn how to be a person in the world. These are similar tropes to Violet Evergarden, I believe. However, Frieren handles them with a little bit more subtlety. It's less of a waterfall and more of a trickling brook. You still feel that sadness. You still feel those tears. You still feel that connection to these characters and their emotional relationships. But Violet Evergarden is unafraid to challenge you and break you. And I find that kind of interesting.